years ago, a professor from the University of Anderson hired some graduate students that went through all the courthouses of Illinois, found over 6,000 cases that had Abraham Lincoln's name on them, and fully 2/3 of them, 4,000, were simple debt collection cases. One farmer would hire another to bring him a load of rocks to put a foundation down for his barn, and then he wouldn't pay for the rocks. So Lincoln would be hired by the guy that had worked so hard digging the rocks and shipping them. They would sue. A judge might assess that part of that person's land would be sold off, and Lincoln would receive part of that profit. He was a very profitable, prosperous lawyer. He fancied himself as one of the first corporate lawyers because he tried to get practice from some of the bigger businesses. And back then, it was this wonderful competitive sense of what was happening out west. The big question was, which of the great enterprises was going to open up the West? Would it be the new steamships and the steamboats that were going up and down the rivers? Or would it be the railroads? There was this tremendous competition, went on for about 15 years. And one night, as luck would have it, one of the new steamboats was coming down the Mississippi River when the river was flooding, got out of control, ran into a railroad bridge, caught on fire, and burned both of them down. Lincoln was hired by the railroad, told to get settlement from this. For 8 years, they paid his retainer, which I'm sure was a pretty healthy retainer for its time. After 8 years, the case was dropped. Nothing was ever resolved. No payment was made. And I've often wondered how the railroad felt when they realized they'd been paying Mr. Lincoln for 8 years and ended up with nothing. Another celebrated case of Mr. Lincoln in the corporate world, a company called McCormick Reaper. Some of you will recognize that name. It ultimately morphed into McCormick Farm Implements. It was based in Chicago. Even back then, it was making plows that were being used to break the prairie. Well, it had a patent infringement case, and it was putting together a team of lawyers based out of Cincinnati. They asked Lincoln to go from Springfield to Cincinnati to meet with the head lawyer and be part of the team. Lincoln was excited. He got on the train. Took him 2 days. He got to Cincinnati. He was interviewed by the lead lawyer, whose name was Edwin Stanton. And after a 15-minute interview, Edwin Stanton fired him on the spot. Called him a second-rate lawyer from a second-rate town, Springfield, Illinois. If that name Edwin Stanton sounds a little familiar to some of you, it was that same Edwin Stanton who about 17 years later was standing over Lincoln's bed in a little boarding house across from Ford's Theater the moment Lincoln died. And he uttered the words, "Now he belongs to the ages." Because even though he had once fired Abraham Lincoln hired him to be Secretary of War, and he did the job brilliantly. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer to the very marrow of his bones. He thought like a lawyer. A good lawyer has this amazing ability to take problems apart, twist them around, look at them from every different angle, and try to see all the possibilities. And those of you who heard the speech the other night are ineligible from this question. You know you are. And you know who you are. Imagine this situation. You're President of the United States. You have very few friends in Congress. Your party has just been thoroughly whomped in the elections. And yet you need more votes. You've got to find more friends in Congress to help you keep the war effort going. Everyone who had been helping Lincoln, it seemed, were starting to turn. He was losing his majority. He had to find more votes in Congress. He had to get more friends in Congress. If you're a brilliant lawyer and you look at the situation, what idea do you come up with to get more friends and find more friends in the United States Congress? You create more states. And then you get more friends in Congress. And that's what Lincoln did. Added the states of Nebraska, Nevada, and West Virginia during the war. He took the situation apart and found a different answer. Abraham Lincoln was brilliant at that. If Abraham Lincoln were here today, I think he would very much want to be remembered as a communicator. Because in that, Abraham Lincoln has absolutely no equal. It is said that Abraham Lincoln has been quoted more often than anyone who has ever spoken the English language. There have been more books written about Abraham Lincoln than any person who ever walked the earth except Jesus Christ himself. That's a pretty good resume. And remember, this from a man for whom there is no evidence that he ever spent a single day in his life in a formal classroom. Lincoln read and read and read and was inspired by those he read. He found a way to craft words in unique and simple ways. Students of American English say that he is now one of the great American writers for what they call clarity. He could say more with just a few words than virtually anyone. In just 267 words, that wonderful Gettysburg Address defined our nation prior to Lincoln's time, at Lincoln's time, and for all time. 267 words. I ran across something just the other day I hadn't seen in a while. It's a short little letter. Some of you will recognize this letter, but I love the way Lincoln used words to lift people up, even at the darkest moment. The letter was written to a lady named Lydia Bixby. It said simply this: I have been shown in the files of the War Department by the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have all died gloriously in battle. I feel how weak and fruitless would be any words of mine in attempting to beguile you of a grief so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic your sons died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage you of the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only cherished memories of the loved and lost and the solemn pride that must be yours for having laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. How's that for crafting a few words? I wonder how many wordsmiths it would take on the President's staff to come up with something so simple as Lincoln presented in that one letter. Lincoln used his language to uplift people, always, always. And believe me, during the Civil War, always meant always. 600,000 Americans died during those 4 years. It was Lincoln's task always to bring people up to the moment, and as contradictory as it may sound, sometimes the way he did it was with humor. He was a great jokester, a great joke teller. And again, he loved using words to do that sometimes. Once he had a priest who came to visit him. The priest had seen a young man grow up in his parish. The man had enlisted in the army. He'd run off, deserted, been brought back, deserted again, was captured, brought back, put on trial, and sentenced to be hung. And the priest came to Abraham Lincoln and sat across his chair in the office pleading for the young man's life. And he said, Mr. President, you must suspend the sentence, because if you do not suspend the sentence at sunrise, the man will be hung. And Lincoln suddenly looked up with this great smile on his face. And I can't imagine what the priest was thinking. And Lincoln called in his secretary, John Hay. And because they always had these little word games, little puns they played between one another. And he said, looking at the Padre, he said, please, Father, say that again. Well, Mr. President, you have to understand, if you don't suspend the sentence by sunrise, the young man will be hung. And Lincoln turned to Hay with a big smile and said, you see, if I don't suspend the sentence by sunrise, at sunrise the sentence will be suspended. 19th century humor doesn't always work in the 20th century. But Lincoln was tremendously proud of himself for that little bit of humor. He often said these wonderful little quotes like, common people are God's favorites, that's why there are so many of them. One of the great generals died during the war, and this general was always into very pompous ceremonies. The ceremony was very great indeed, and as Lincoln was leaving the funeral, he turned to his cabinet and said, this was such a grand, grand funeral. If the general had known it was going to be this grand, he would have died 5 years earlier just to be part of it.